This right here is the Sega Genesis. Time to review it. If there was one gaming company that had the balls to take on the mighty Nintendo back in the early 90s, it was Sega. Now, most people nowadays recognize Sega as a video game publishing company, but at one point in time, they also made game consoles. Their very first gaming system was the Sega SG-1000 in Japan and the Sega Master System here in the United States and Europe. But unfortunately, they couldn't even compete against the mighty Nintendo Entertainment System. That thing was a runaway train of success. It wouldn't be until the Sega Genesis in 1989 that Sega was finally able to put up a decent fight against Nintendo. And when it came to marketing the Sega Genesis, especially here in the States, Sega was ruthless. They straight up called out and even made fun of Nintendo in most of their commercials.
16-bit arcade graphics. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. 16-bit arcade action. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. 16-bit arcade hits. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. What Nintendon't? The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Man, the early 90s was such a wild time. Like, imagine nowadays if, like, Xbox had a commercial that straight up called out PlayStation and made fun of them. Imagine that. Thanks to being marketed mainly towards an older audience, thousands of must-play games and absolutely amazing franchises that got their start on the Sega Genesis, even by Sega themselves. The Sega Genesis is still a great console and sold about 30.75 million units worldwide between 1988 and 1997. Now, even though the Sega Genesis was a little bit before my time, I still remember fond memories of playing this console, mainly because my dad had one. I want to say he got one back in either 94 or 95. It was a few years before I was even born, but I remember when I was little, I had always watched him play Sonic the Hedgehog, and it was so much fun. And honestly, now that I think about it, the Sega Genesis might actually be the very first game console I ever played. I mainly use my Raspberry Pi nowadays to play Sega Genesis games, so it's been quite a few years since I've actually played Genesis games on real hardware. This one that you see in front of you right now is currently on loan to me for the purposes of this video. And it's also technically the second model of the Sega Genesis, titled the Model 2. This one was released around 1992 and was mainly bundled with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and a couple of other games throughout its lifespan as well. And then I think around 1997, Sega basically licensed out the Genesis hardware to Majesco, and they released the Sega Model 3, which was, believe it or not, even smaller than this. The original model of the Sega Genesis, which released in 1989, was a little different compared to this. It was slightly larger, and basically, I'd say it's about that big. And believe it or not, it actually had a headphone jack built in, plus with like a volume gauge, so that you could actually plug in headphones straight into the console. That's actually really cool. Plus, throughout the Sega Genesis's lifespan, Sega would end up releasing a couple of accessories that extended the life of the Sega Genesis. One of them was the Sega CD, which I believe came out in either 1991 or 1992. Basically, there's an expansion port on the side of the Genesis that would plug into the Sega CD, and it basically gave the system a new library of games using the brand new compact disc format. And then also, I want to say around 94, they released the Sega 32X, which was an add-on that plugged straight into the cartridge slot up here, is about this big, and that also gave it a new library of games exclusive to that accessory that basically gave the system 32-bit capabilities. Neither one of those accessories sold very well, unfortunately. So let's take a closer look at this thing, shall we? So on the front of the system, obviously we have the Sega Genesis logo right here above the cartridge slot, which is where obviously your game cartridges go in, because this was around the time that game consoles used game cartridges instead of compact discs or even digital download like nowadays. And then we also have the Sega logo down here, of course. Can't forget that you're playing a Sega console. And then we also have a power button to obviously power on the system. And then we have a little LED strip looking thing that basically illuminates red when the system's on. And then we also have a reset button. On the front of the system we have two controller ports. They look really similar to the Atari 2600's controller ports, and I want to say that you can actually use Atari joysticks with the Sega Genesis. I could be wrong though. And Sega also released accessories that plugged into the controller port that basically gave the system 4 controller ports instead of 2. On the left side of the system there's nothing, and on the right side of the system there's nothing, except there's a little flap right here on the bottom of the system. If you push it down and pull it out, you see this red tab right here. If I can get it out, okay, I might not be able to, but underneath that red tab is basically a circuit board that would plug into the Sega CD accessory. On the bottom of the system we have air vents, 4 rubber feet to prevent the system from sliding around. We have toll-free Sega information to basically, if you need help with like setting up the system, or if you need help with like troubleshooting. I almost wonder if that's still the exact same toll-free number that they use. We'll also find some FCC nonsense, Sega Genesis system console. Model number is MK-1631, and then we have the console serial number. On the back of the system we have the AC power, AV out, which supports coaxial and composite video, and then a little hole right here. I'm not entirely sure what that's for. I want to say that is for holding in the, I want to say it's for the Sega CD add-on, or at least the one that's compatible with the Model 2. That way it basically clips into here. I'm not entirely sure on that though. Here's the controller for the Sega Genesis. This was the original design of the Genesis controller that they used up until, I want to say, like 92 or 93, where basically they updated the design a little bit and then they added 6 buttons instead of 4, or instead of 3. Yeah, I'd say it's a fairly comfortable controller. I do like the SNES controller a little bit more, since it actually has shoulder buttons and this one doesn't, but honestly, it's still a pretty good retro controller. We have the D-pad right here, which actually feels pretty nice. Rotates really easily. We also have our start button and our A, B, and C buttons. And then on the 6-button Sega Genesis controller, not only did you have A, B, C, but you also had X, Y, Z at the top as well. I do recommend picking up a 6-button Sega Genesis controller, because a lot of games play much better with that controller, and I think some even require it too. I'm not entirely sure on that though. So what exactly is powering the Sega Genesis? Well, for a CPU it uses a Motorola 68000 clocked at 7.6 MHz, along with a Zlog Z80 coprocessor clocked at 3.58 MHz. For memory it has 64 kilobytes of RAM, 64 kilobytes of VRAM, and 8 kilobytes of audio RAM. For video output, the Sega Genesis supports RGB SCART, coaxial, and composite video. For video output resolutions, the Genesis basically supports progressive and interlaced. For progressive, it supports 320 by 224, 256 by 224, or 320 by 240 and 256 by 240, with 512 color palette and 61 colors on screen. And then for interlaced, it supports 320 by 448, 256 by 448, or 320 by 480, and 256 by 480. For a sound chip, it uses a Yamaha YM2612 and a Texas Instruments SN76489. The Genesis is also backwards compatible with Master System games, although that does require a separate accessory to do that. And finally, the Sega Genesis Model 2 measures in at 11.9 by 9.6 by 3.2 inches and weighs approximately 4 pounds. Here's the games that I have for the system for this video. In terms of game prices, especially nowadays, since the Sega Genesis is like, what, over 30 years old already, they can wildly vary online, depending on if it's a first-party title, a third-party title, if it's sold well, etc. By far the most expensive titles are the ones that come in the original box as well as the instruction manual. But for the loose cartridges themselves, they're usually the cheapest to get. Again, it really depends on what title that you're getting. So first up, we have Mortal Kombat. This is a port of, obviously, Mortal Kombat, the original arcade game from 1993. And let me tell you, this is actually a really, really good port. I played this game so much with my dad and my brother growing up. Probably shouldn't have, because it's not it's not really the type of game that a child should be playing, but whatever. The console ports of Mortal Kombat are pretty infamous for removing a lot of the gore and blood from the original arcade game. However, the Sega Genesis version actually has a cheat code that you can put in at the main menu that will basically re-enable the blood and gore, just like the way it was supposed to be intended. Definitely not a bad port. I do recommend it. Arcade Classics. This is basically a compilation cartridge that has 3 classic arcade games from the 70s. There's Centipede, Missile Command, and Pong. I've never played this one before, so I have no idea exactly how well these play on the Sega Genesis. I would assume they would play pretty authentically, since these are pretty old-ass games anyway, but what do I know? The Adventures of Batman and Robin. I remember playing this one a lot growing up, and let me tell you, this is by far the hardest game I have ever played, bar none. It is ridiculously difficult, but it is still a lot of fun. It looks and sounds great for the Sega Genesis. By far the best way to experience this game is with 2-player, because you're most definitely not going to get very far in single player whatsoever. Just fair warning. But yeah, great game if you can handle the punishingly difficulty. Side Pocket. Again, I haven't played this one before, although I do love me some pool games no matter what the platform. I'm sure it's a decent game. I mean, it's made by Data East, so it's got to mean something. Genesis 6-Pack. This is another compilation cart, although instead of arcade games, this actually has authentic retail Sega Genesis games. It comes with 6 in all. It's got Sonic the Hedgehog, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, Columns, and Super Hang-On. I played all of these games, and they are absolutely great. So, yeah. It's a great compilation cart. What can I say? And finally, my favorite Sega Genesis game, and hell, one of my favorite games of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I watched my dad play this game all the time growing up, and when I got to play Sonic the Hedgehog on my own on other systems that I owned at the time, it was awesome. It was such a blast, especially playing multiplayer with my brother. The game plays great, it looks great, it sounds great, it's really fun in multiplayer. What else can I say? This game is just an absolute classic on the Sega Genesis. You're an absolute fool if you do not pick up this game for your Genesis. Alright, it's time to go back to the 90s and play some frickin' Sega Genesis. Oh yeah. Unlike most older consoles, since the Sega Genesis's library was mainly 2D games, a lot of the games have aged remarkably well and still hold up great today, like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 here. One thing that hasn't quite aged as well is the video output of the Sega Genesis. Like I mentioned before, it supports coax, composite video, and RGB SCART. That is if you live in Europe. Right now I'm using the composite cables, and it doesn't clean up nice on an HD TV. Let's just put it that way. However, thanks to the homebrew modding community, you can actually get an HDMI mod for the Sega Genesis that basically taps directly into the RGB SCART output of the Sega Genesis, which looks much, much better. It does require some knowledge of soldering though, and I unfortunately don't have those kinds of skills, so yeah. But, you know, like I said before, I use my Raspberry Pi to play Sega Genesis games anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me. The Sega Genesis controller feels really nice in the hands. I do think that the SNES controller is a little better, but still, I'd say the Sega Genesis controller still feels really nice and comfortable. Buttons feel really nice and responsive. The D-pad feels really nice too. Do keep in mind, due to the age of the Sega Genesis, some of the controllers might start to break down after a while. I know the one in particular that I have right now, basically everything still works, but the membrane that actually pushes on the circuit board on the buttons is starting to deteriorate, so sometimes you got to use some extra force to actually get feedback. But other than that, it's a pretty easy fix anyway. One thing that can be a little annoying about old Genesis games, especially with these 2D side-scroller beat-em-ups, is character movement. So obviously when I'm moving back and forth, it's relatively fine, but moving up and down, yeah, it's pretty painfully slow. Not the greatest, but it certainly helps that the D-pad on the Sega Genesis controller rotates around an axis, so that it definitely helps in that regards. But still, it's a little. Some games are a little wonky to control, that's for sure. Like I mentioned before, the best way to play fighting games on the Sega Genesis is with the 6-button controller, and yeah, this makes playing fighting games way better, especially with Mortal Kombat, where instead of pressing a combination of buttons, you can just use the additional XYZ buttons, and it really makes a difference. Fun fact about Mortal Kombat, it was one of the very first games of its time to use motion capture for the character sprites, which is actually really cool. Also, it was one of the leading causes to the ESRB rating system for games. Due to its violent nature, a lot of kids ended up playing this game in arcades, and parents were not happy. Oh, this is actually a pretty decent version of Missile Command. Huh. It's not perfectly one-to-one to the original arcade game, but it plays pretty authentically on Sega Genesis, or at least pretty damn close. And so, that was the Sega Genesis. This thing could have easily failed to compete with Nintendo back in the 90s. However, thanks to an aggressive marketing campaign, a library of fantastic games, the Sega Genesis is probably one of the best consoles of the early 90s. But should you pick one up in 2022? I'll leave this one up to you guys, because it can go either way. If you want to go back and re-experience this Sega Genesis library, but don't necessarily have the room or even the money to pick up the actual games and the console itself, I would recommend just sticking with like an emulator on like Raspberry Pi or on PC, or really any Sega Genesis game that's been re-released on modern systems. But for those who grew up back in the early 90s, or even ones that had a Sega Genesis back then yeah, I do recommend picking up one of these. In terms of prices for the consoles themselves, they're still relatively affordable as of recording this video. I have noticed that the cheapest ones to pick up are the Model 2 or the Model 3. The Model 1 is still fairly affordable, but due to the age of that one, and since it's pretty sought after by most people, that one can be a little higher priced nowadays. By far the most expensive version of the Genesis was the Sega CD-X, which was basically a combo unit of the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD built into one console. That thing is ridiculously rare nowadays, and it can be very, very pricey. And if you're going to pick up a Sega Genesis nowadays, I highly recommend either playing it on a real original CRT television or doing the HDMI mod. Because, let me tell you, this thing does not clean up very well on an HD TV at all. So that wraps up another review. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. The Sega Genesis controller feels really nice in the hands. I do think that the SNES controller is a little better, but still... Oh. Shit, the game crashed. Oops. Restart.